mentioned, we will be recording today's lecture. We haven't started that yet, so we'll let you know when that will start. And as Jessica said, if you don't want your face to be in the recording, you should turn your camera off. We do stop the recording before we get into the Q&A, so that hopefully allows us to have a bit more free of a discussion when we get to that point. In terms of the Q&A, please put any queries you might have for Páraic in the chat function, and Katie will be managing that at the end of the presentation. I also just wanted to acknowledge the committee who have planned this lecture series. So that includes myself and my fellow diversity allies, Lorraine Burke and Becky Cruz, as well as the ARA Ireland training officers, who are Jessica, who you heard from earlier, and Katie as well. So with that, Jessica, I think you can turn the recording on, and I'll introduce Páraic.
On.
Great. Okay. So today's speaker is Páraic Kerrigan, who will be presenting his lecture, Waking the Hirschfield, an Oral and Archival History of Dublin's Hirschfeld Centre, 1979 to 1987. Páraic is an author, researcher, and assistant professor in the School of Information and Communication Studies at University College Dublin. He has published widely as an academic and critic in the area of queer Irish culture. He's the author of the Irish Times bestselling book, Reeling in the Queers, Tales of Ireland LGBTQ Past, which was also nominated for Best Irish Published Book at the 2024 On Post Book Awards. His second nonfiction book will be released this year, 2026. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and just a thank you to everyone at ARA Ireland for having me here today. So welcome, everybody. And I hope that I'm going to impart something new in terms of a building you may not have heard before. Or if you have heard of the Hirschfeld Centre, perhaps I'm going to give you a number of new perspectives around this. So to give you some context as to how I got here to speak to you all today, 10 years ago, I started my PhD research. And while doing my PhD research, as I was speaking to activists within the Irish LGBTQ community, they were seasoned and they had kind of been through the trenches, as it were, in the context of the AIDS crisis, the fact that criminalization was in place up until 1993, coupled with homophobic violence of the 1980s. And when they were recounting their experiences to me when I was doing my PhD research, it was so odd and peculiar, but maybe not so odd and peculiar, that all roads led back to the Hirschfeld Centre. They all said that the Hirschfield shaped who they were, the activism that they performed, and they noted that without the Hirschfield, that many of Ireland's progressions would never have happened. And I kind of got really fascinated and interested to understand this. I was like, okay, well, I need to find out more about the building. So I went to look, and there wasn't really all that much about it. There were some materials in the Irish Queer Archive in the National Library of Ireland, and some of the materials in there are actually from the Hirschfield itself. But other than that, the building itself kind of fell into the context of memory. And therein, I realized, wow, okay, so for us to re-brick the Hirschfield, as we now call it, we're going to have to actually reach out, find people who went there, the activists who were involved in running the building, the shareholders who were involved in running the company, and the actual regular person from Mayo, Donegal, Northern Ireland, who came down to go to that building to feel at home and to feel part of the community for the first time. So these are the central motivations behind that. So in today's talk, let me just make sure and hope and pray that the slides are going to move for us, and they are going to move. So that is our first success. In today's talk, I want to maybe give an overview as to the importance of oral histories and the fragility of archives, and how the fragility of the archive and our formal institutional archives highlights the fact that for institutions that mean so much to people, where they have shared community experiences, these are quite ephemeral spaces, you know? And yet, because they're ephemeral and we're not recording them properly, we risk losing really rich histories, because a building and the bricks and mortar of a building can hold within its walls so many stories, so many nights of passion, so many really devastating times of despair, and also coming through that despair with sheer joy. But if we don't record our histories efficiently, or if we don't even ask the people who attended particular buildings what they felt, or how they felt, or what their experiences were, we are going to lose those histories. So there's a fragility here in terms of that oral histories can help us recuperate. So to a degree, this is sort of an element of oral archival activism, I would say, and this is kind of one of the frameworks I have developed for the book. But that's kind of my pitch as to how I got here, why I'm doing this, and why we're kind of getting this together. So in today's very brief lecture, I know we have like just 30 minutes or so, I'm going to talk to you about the sense of embodied archives and effective histories. And before we get to the Hirschfield, a really, really brief whistle-stop tour of queer spaces and places in Dublin. How do we get to the Hirschfield? And why are queer spaces and places important? And then some of the major findings that are coming from the project, some of which are delicious, some of which are really gossipy. And gossipy because, again, that's the benefit of oral history, right? You really get into the rigorous ins and outs and the nitty-gritty of social relations between people. And that in and of itself has some really effective, rich history that is also just quite outrageous in places. So we're going to look at shared and fractious first encounters and fragmented remembrance through the politics of dance. So those are just two of the themes of 9 that we've developed. This is part of a book that's coming out with the University of Liverpool Press, and we're actually submitting and pressing send on that book in May. So we've been working on this project, no joke, I counted it before I did this talk, for 10 years. So we're coming to the end of a 10-year process. That's how long it has taken us to find people, work with this, ensure diversity of voices, and get this together. So, making queer spaces and forging queer places. So, from the founding of the Irish Free State up until the sexual liberation movement in 1973, it wasn't, history might tell us that from the 1970s onwards, a confident gay community started to emerge in the city and in spaces across Ireland. But in actual fact, prior to Ireland getting its independence and the founding of the Free State, there were subterranean gay-friendly bars and spaces across the city. And one of the earliest ones that have been recorded have been the Gresham and the Shelburne. These tended to become really significant spaces for middle-class men to go to. And again, it was all hiding in plain sight. It was having a drink, not doing anything untoward to bring unnecessary attention to them, but it was a space to go to meet people like you. And then there was also the United Arts Club for socializing. Now, these are spaces that men tended to go to. Where lesbians and women met has not necessarily been recorded as well as men. So Paul Cannon describes that within theatre and opera circles, suede shoes were signalled as affiliation. So wearing suede shoes was a deliberate decision that people would make in theatre circles in Dublin, the likes of the Theatre Royal and whatnot, and that was a marker of your sexual identity. Kind of similar to Oscar Wilde wearing a green carnation, right? He used to wear green carnations and ask queer people in London on the theatre scene to wear green carnations when they go to plays so they can spot each other in the crowd and kind of have a rendezvous or a dalliance or a drink after the show. So these are the sorts of the subterranean codes developed by the community. So again, all about hiding in plain sight. And in 1932, we had the Eucharistic Congress. And this highly religious, extremely Catholic event, shock horror, doubled up as discreet meeting spots for gay encounters, when throughout the city there was the erection of Parisian-style pissoirs, and these became meeting points for men and clergy to have rendezvous, as it were. So these are some of the early spaces, and from the 1930s onwards, pubs and cafes across Dublin quietly gained reputations as gay-friendly spaces. So the likes of Davy Byrne's on Duke Street, which is still there, was possibly run by a gay proprietor, Davy Byrne, who was buried with his close male companion. And in history, we tend to suggest or tend to think that when people are buried together, when they're of the same sex, that perhaps they were romantic companions. The Bailey also attracted a more professional crowd of judges and lawyers in the 1950s. And again, the Bailey was a prominent example there. After hours, the infamous catacombs at 13 Fitzwilliam Place often offered uninhibited sexual freedom, and Brendan Bean was a known frequenter of that institution. And Bewley's Cafe on Grafton Street from 1948 onwards became a really, really significant hotspot for the more regular socializing around a coffee or a scone or something. And that remained the case up until the 2000s, before Bewley's closed for one of the first of many times. So some of the most significant places, as I noted, were Bartley Dunn's. Bartley Dunn's was on 32 Lower Stevens Green, and it was a beloved gay-friendly bar. David Norris would refer to it as the space where theatrical old queens would go to. And then you'd Rice's. Rice's was actually on the spot where Stephen's Green shopping centre is right now. It had one side facing the green and then the other side facing towards the Gaiety or the Olympia, whichever theatre. I always get the two mixed up. The theatre that's across the road there. So where that shopping centre is now, when you walk through those entrances, and fingers crossed they don't do that horrendous new facade over that current one. So let's protest Dublin City Council putting that forward. That was actually the spot of one of Ireland's premier and first gay bars, Rice's. That was really, really prominent. There was two sections. One at the back was referred to as the geriatric ward by the younger people, and at the front, younger people would go to. So there was other notable spots. These included the Viking Bar, which was actually Dublin's first openly gay managed pub and self-identifying. You had places like Pygmalion, Parliament Inn, and the Pembroke. So why am I sharing all of this? Because to get to the Hirschfield, it doesn't just emerge out of nowhere. There are burgeoning movements happening. People need to congregate to create community, right? To feel a part of something. And the Hirschfield was just another part of that story. I would argue the most significant part, but it comes from somewhere. So our final piece in the puzzle before we arrive at 10 Fownes Street Upper in Temple Bar, where the Hirschfeld Centre was based, was through the rise and fall of the Irish gay rights movement, the IGRM. So on the right here of the slide, you will see the photo of the founding members of the Irish gay rights movement. You have David Norris, much younger, on the far left. You have Edmund Lynch in the middle. And you have Sean Connolly on the far right, who just passed last week. Very sad but so let's kind of remember Sean right now, a week after his passing. So these were very brave men that came together and founded a community. So once the IGRM was founded, they said to themselves, right, now that we're together, we need to be visible. We need to have a space of some description. So they rented a space, 46 Parnell Square, near where the Sinn Féin headquarters are, if you want to kind of position that in your head. And they established what was called as the Phoenix Club. This was Dublin's first dedicated queer and social political hub. It hosted discos, women-only nights, even a drama group, and speaker forums, along with a Tell a Friend helpline. A swathe of crucial, significant resources for the city and Ireland more broadly. It was the first of its kind in the country and really significant. So there was a massive male dominance in the leadership, but you had women who were carving out a space. Activists like Terry Blanche and Phil Carson, they created what was known as the Lavender Room inside one of the rooms in the Phoenix Club, which was dedicated for women and lesbian activism. However, quite quickly, tension started to emerge in the IGRM, centered around power struggles, but prominently personality differences. David Norris, on the one hand, wanted to be out, visible, public, and focus on decriminalization of homosexuality. On the other side, there was a lot of people in the IGRM who were more focused on the social element, ensuring that there was discos, spaces, phone lines, again, as important, right? But they were also concerned with the amount of visibility David Norris was bringing to the movement. And as a result of this, the movement fell apart. They didn't want David bringing attention, and with it, because visibility and attention comes more scrutiny, more surveillance, and perhaps potential violence. So legitimate in terms of both positions, but nonetheless, a palace coup emerged and the IGRM fell apart. And as a result, this led to the loss of the Phoenix Club. So it's within this context where there's a space and a gap in the market, as it were, for a new centre. So here they said, we need to find a new building, a new space. So herein is where we get the Hirschfeld Centre. So again, just for you to visualize this and to give you some context, the Hirschfeld ran for 9 years. It ran from 1979 to 1988. And in those 9 years, it was politically, socially, and culturally significant, with many of the firsts for Ireland's LGBT community happening within this building right here. This is a picture of the building after the fire. The Hirschfeld ended after 9 years because, in a suspected arson attack, the building went ablaze on November 4th, 1988. And the Hirschfeld became no more. Sorry, it was 1987. 8 years of it. So my maths is dreadful, but I'm here to write a book, not do maths. So yes, you can do the maths yourselves. But yes, 87 was when it demised. And as you can see here, the Hirschfeld Centre was destroyed by fire on Wednesday, November 4th. Check notices on right for new phones and venues. The Hirschfeld never came back again. The community was absolutely devastated following the fire. One man whom I interviewed said that he arrived at the building and started sobbing against the wall because he knew that that was an era of his life that was over and that things would never be the same again. Several other people around the city came and laid wreaths at the door. Such was the level of their grief for this space that meant so much for them. But how do we get to this building running for 9 years? So after the IGRM split, 25 key activists gathered and they said, right, the Phoenix Club is gone. We need to get something together. So the National Gay Federation, the NGF, was founded. And with that, they wanted to secure a long-term place. So they were looking around the city and they eventually found a rundown warehouse in Temple Bar. For context for you all, I'm sure some of you are familiar with this, but it's not the Temple Bar you are familiar with now. Geographically, spatially, and place-wise, it was significantly different to the extent that it was a dive. It was essentially where foxes and sex workers were, places were absolutely dilapidated to the extent that when the BBC wanted to include footage of post-war Berlin after World War II in in documentaries, they would come to Temple Bar and film cutaways there and use the Temple Bar shots in lieu of Berlin. So that will tell you the state Temple Bar was in at the time. In the 70s to the 80s, it was meant to be redeveloped as the central bus centre for the country, Bus Oris, but that never happened. So there was kind of a holding sort of thing happening in Temple Bar where no redevelopment was happening. So the rent was low and the activists identified 10 Fownes Street. They wanted to avoid what happened also with the Phoenix Club. So they said, we need this sustainable, we need this long term, and we need the community invested. So David Norris, Edmund Lynch, Bernard Keogh, and Brian Murray established Hirschfield Enterprises Limited. And they used this as the artifact, the edifice through which they could engage with banks to get a mortgage because they wanted to own the building for the community on its own terms. So the building also was called the Hirschfeld Centre because it was named after Magnus Hirschfeld, the German sexologist who had an institute for sex research in the 1930s in Berlin. This institute was completely destroyed in Germany with the rise of the Third Reich, and all of his research was destroyed. Two reasons for this. One, the Hirschfeld founders wanted to honor this individual who was part of a broader transnational European gay history. But secondly, calling the building Magnus Hirschfeld, if anyone walked by the building who was Irish, who was straight, they'd be like, I've no idea who that is or what that is. Whereas if it was the Oscar Wilde Centre, you could guess what's happening inside. So this was again an effort to try and have something in plain sight that didn't bring attention, visibility, and potential violence to the building. So the area's low rents, bohemian atmosphere, and discreet location made it an ideal place. And many gay men also live nearby. Volunteers transformed the dilapidated warehouse with extensive renovations, fire safety upgrades, and creative reuse. And they even included RTE's stage designs for a vibrant disco and donated work from supportive designers, carpenters, and sound engineers. Fun fact, and again, when you do these kinds of oral histories, you get fun facts that you wouldn't necessarily get from the archive. The disco space on the first floor where the Flikkers disco was, more on that soon, that was developed from an RTE set. Edmund Lynch, one of the founders of the Hirschfeld Centre, as I noted, and the gay rights movement, worked in RTE. And one day he was leaving work and was passing a skip. And the National Song Contest, which is Ireland's process for selecting the entry to go to the Eurovision, they had dumped their set, which was a fabulous set for the time, in a skip. And Edmund went back in and said, can I have that set, please? And they went, okay, well, we're going to throw it out, so it's yours. So he used the set and he installed this professional style television studio piece to essentially create the space of Flikkers. And again, that's such a little rich piece of material history, right? That I wouldn't necessarily have gotten had I not spoken to Edmund. So also the Hirschfeld offered a raft of services. It was the home of Ireland's first and only gay cinema. A 55-seat cinema was on its top floor. It had a community library donated by author John Broderick and a number of multi-purpose spaces, such as phone lines, lesbian line, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of where we are in terms of context, what this building was. I hope that kind of gives you a solid grounding before I kind of go into the specifics of things here, right? So what is the overview of the project, Our Waking the Hirschfeld? So we started back in 2016 in terms of thinking, structuring, writing around this, doing the archival work. And we worked in the Irish Archive, National Library of Ireland, newspaper archives, the Cork LGBT archive, and personal archives of Hirschfield patrons. We then also looked to collect oral histories. So we did 60 oral history interviews over the last number of years. So the data collection primarily happened 2021 to 2024, but even though the book is due soon, we're still taking histories because people still come out of the woodwork, and we of course will speak to anyone. So it's an iterative and flexible methodology. So what we mean here is that we are adaptive, we're community informed, and we evolve based on participant input. So generally interviews are one-to-one, but we had a group of lesbians who were active in the Hirschfield, and they said to us, our activism was always collective. We don't feel comfortable necessarily interviewing, doing our oral history alone. Could we do it as a group? And I went, yes, absolutely. Let's do this as a group. So that was really rich. So that was one instance. I'd won a couple whom I'll note at the end of the lecture. They met at the Hirschfield and they wanted to do it together to tell their love story, as it were. So different formats for what the participants wanted. And then interestingly, some wanted to revisit the building. So we did walking oral history tours with some people, and that was really interesting. They wanted to actually go back to the space, walk around, and as they did so, we walked together, we recorded them, and all these memories started coming back and flooding. In one instance, we were outside the building itself, literally directly across the road, and this kind of demonstrates to you how space and place in Temple Bar has even transformed in the space of nearly 50 years. We're standing there watching, and an individual was recounting his first time going into the building, how nervous he was, and just kind of how unassuming the space was, how Temple Bar was dilapidated. And then this family of five came up and keyed in a code into the building, and we noted that where the Flikkers disco was in the Hirschfield building as it is now an Airbnb. So I went to check it out, and the apartment on that floor sold for like $1 million, just like one floor of what the Hirschfeld Centre was. So it's kind of wild how the space and place changes over time. But yeah, he kind of was like, oh my God, where I danced and had my first kiss is where five people are now sleeping in an Airbnb. And so that was just kind of a strange interaction we had. But that's the sort of iterative and flexible methodology that we fostered in the project. So inevitably, when you're doing oral history is based on memory. Memory itself is not fixed. It's plastic, it's elastic, and it changes over time. It changes as a result of aging. Memory in of itself can be grounded in a particular time and space. Smells can trigger, like the memories of the people who did the walking archival oral histories with us versus those on the Zooms or in their kitchens. Different dynamics will trigger different kinds of memories at different points. And so, as a result, inevitably, in the recollections we get from people, there's ambivalent recollections. For example, one person said that they remember a condom machine, whereas the activists who ran the building said we can never get a condom machine in the building because we would have been shut down by the police, because condoms were illegal in Ireland until it was somewhat legalized in 1985 under very particular circumstances. So all of these things and aspects were at play here, but you have ambivalent and contested recollections, and it's about squaring that circle to iron out the creases to make things that bit more consistent. So we've ambivalent recollections on the music that was played there, the kind of dancing that happened, the forms of activism, how the phone lines were managed, working in the cafes, the existence of a bar or a cafe. Some people recall going to the cafe and others to that there was a bar, but the Hirschfield never really had a bar. It had a cafe bar that sold fizzy orange. It couldn't sell alcohol because of licensing laws. And all these kinds of things emerge. And in this photo here, you see Dermot Moore, who was one of the founders of the National Gay Federation youth group, working on the coffee bar at an NGF youth group morning. So some of our key themes have been a broad constellation. And here you can see on the right an image of that, what the coffee bar looked like with the Flikkers dance floor behind. You can see a can of lilt here, although you can see some lager. So somebody obviously got that in legally. But nonetheless, and also the quaintness of the milk and the coffee there, right? You know, quite a constellation for a night out in a gay club. So some of the broad constellations that emerge are unwanted guests and unexpected visitors. And I'll give you one instance of this. We had one person who said, right, I'm really building up the courage to go in, and he was a seminarian in Maynooth. So as he was building up the courage to go in, he identified that the NGF youth group met on Sundays in the Hirschfield. So he built up the courage to go in. He got out of Maynooth on a Sunday, got the 66 from Maynooth into Dublin city centre, walked up to Temple Bar, and he paced out and around the building, paced and paced and paced. Couldn't build up the courage in that occasion to go in. And he committed to go, right, next week I'm going into that building and I'm going to see what's in there. So he did the same again, finally built up the courage and went in. Who did he see? Only another seminarian from Maynooth. So that was quite an interesting occasion. But also in terms of other unwanted guests and unexpected visitors, individuals who were bullied by their school bully saw their school bully on the dance floor or somewhere in the space. And they were like, oh, so that's what all that was about. So lots of these interesting things emerged. So we also had HIV and AIDS activism and the politics of that in the Hirschfield. Lots of people remember this through the lens and prism of the AIDS crisis. Then it's the formal politics and the radical activism and the forms of coalitional activism that emerged out of the Hirschfield. Having a space in a community centre that brought people together enabled coalitions, but in the same breath, that also created tensions and fractures and divisions. And a really significant finding we weren't expecting were children of the Hirschfield. So that NGF youth group was a really significant aspect, and this became a pipeline for young queer people, teenagers, to find each other and have friends in an Ireland that was completely against them, as it were, in the 1980s, which were, as all of the participants noted, quite a bleak time. So they were discussing how this was really significant and important for them to be able to connect. So they referred to themselves, and this comes from their oral histories, as children of the Hirschfield. Then we have the likes of information activism, so creating zines, magazines, alternative queer publications, and the many gay men who died of AIDS-related illnesses during the crisis. So during this talk, I say three here. I'm just going to focus on two because I'd love to give you everything, but I can't because we're strained for time. So I'm going to look at shared and fractured first encounters, that theme, and then also fragmented remembrance and the politics of dance. So Flikkers at the Hirschfield. So there's 2 of 9, and to read the rest, the book will be out next year, so you can catch the rest there. But to our first theme. Oh, we're going way too fast. So shared and fractured first encounters. What exactly do I mean by this? It wasn't a theme that we had actually expected to encounter. And what we mean by shared and fractured first encounters is, how do people come to cross the threshold of the Hirschfield? How did they hear about it? But also, how did they feel about it? And we quickly discovered that there was actually a ritualistic practice that nearly every single individual went through before they crossed that threshold. Firstly, many refer to themselves in terms of entering the Hirschfield as going into Oz for the first time. And a lot of participants, most of them gay men, referred to themselves as Dorothy. And again, a number of them said, it was as if I was living in black and white, and then I crossed over the threshold of the Hirschfield, which you can see right here, where that wooden board is in the blue building. That's a view from the Hirschfield on the top of Fownes Street, looking towards the quays. So you kind of get an image of what Temple Bar is looking like there at the time. Not necessarily anything too nice. But they said walking across the threshold was like going from black and white to Technicolor. So they developed this ritualistic practice of walking around Temple Bar prior to entering. And in this, they would find out, they'd ring up, tell a friend and say, come on in, we have meet and greets happening here, or we Flikkers happening on a Thursday night. And they'd go and they'd walk around and they'd pace around the central bank, go to the other side of Temple Bar down by Dame Street, walk up again, and they'd circle and circle and circle. They didn't want to hang around too long outside the Hirschfeld Centre in case anyone saw them going in. They also were just afraid of what was on the other side. Many recall failed attempts of crossing that threshold. Such was the pressure, such was the anxiety, such was everything to do and entangled with being gay at this point. So first encounters are remembered through the phone line, through finding any kind of information in the likes of In Dublin magazine or Hot Press. These were the only periodicals and magazines at the time that would take any listings from queer people. So they're just some of the first encounters. So as part of these pathways, you have helplines as vital gateways. So Tell a Friend, which was established in 74, moved to the Hirschfield once the Phoenix Club collapsed, and the lesbian line then becomes established there. And for many, these phone lines were the only safe starting point to discover and access to Hirschfield and its supportive community. And really interestingly, and again, it tells you something about the 80s and life in Ireland at the time. One of our participants said we were on the waiting list in Dublin for a phone line, and the waiting list was like a year long at the time. So he was like, I had actually no phone to ring tell a friend at all. So I had to knock on my neighbour's house who had gotten a phone line installed, and I said, can I please use your phone? And she was like, yes, absolutely. So he goes upstairs to the neighbour's house, to her bedroom where the phone was, and then takes off his jacket to soundproof the door at the bottom to ensure that the conversation doesn't travel out in case she's listening. And he called to tell a friend from a clipping he ripped out of In Dublin magazine, the advertisement, and he calls them and he's like whispering down the phone to them, and they can obviously tell that he's ringing under a very particular set of circumstances that are a risk to him, or at the very least he doesn't want anyone to know. So they agree to meet him. They have a meet up in a hotel lobby, and they kind of just do this as a vibe check, as we might say now. And essentially they go, right, okay, so would you like to come up to the Hirschfield just to see what it looks like? And that in and of itself was some of the people's first encounters with the building. And personal stories like Mick Quinlan's, he recalls a bus journey, and on that bus he fails the first time and then comes back a second time. Owen Casterly was that person who called from a neighbour's bedroom. Shows how that phone conversation gives people the courage to take their step out of secrecy and fear and cross the threshold. So you also have volunteers who bridged the private space of someone's life when they're trying to come out and the public world of the Hirschfield. You had volunteers such as Martin Barnes, Reg Dean, Pauline O'Donnell, and Joni Crone, who answered calls from people in distress, offering not only a listening ear, but also arranging discreet and supportive face-to-face meetings. In the case of Pauline O'Donnell, she travelled far and wide. She went to the west of Ireland to meet somebody, to kind of let them know there's a community there. So this pathway to first encounter created trust, empathy, and solidarity, and enabled people to come out. The Hirschfield actually helped a generation of people to come out. But also, these three things were part of this ritual of even getting across the building, right? You have a moment of fear and anticipation, you have a slow and personal rite of passage, and you also have observing before belonging. So, in the case of, for many, the hardest part of the Hirschfield experience was not what happened inside the building, but finding the courage to enter. Stories from John Kilcullen, Paul Rudden, Owen Casterly reveal how standing outside, pacing the block, or sitting in the car across the road, literally where you can see here in the last slide, right? People sat right there, down where that white car is, or where they are looking up, seeing what was going on, building up the courage, and trying to win that emotional battle between fear, longing, and hope. And one of the participants said, I didn't know what I was expecting going into the Hirschfield. I thought it was going to be some sort of perpetual orgy. And then they were like, well, when I went inside, I was quite disappointed. It was none of that, because it was just plain and simple, and it was amazing, but it was not what I had built it up to be. Then you also have a slow and personal rite of passage. Crossing the threshold often unfolded over days, weeks, or multiple failed attempts. Some, like Paul Rudden, watched others press the buzzer before daring to do it themselves. Others needed alcohol to build up the courage. So they're just some of the aspects of the ritual. So here we have Jerry Moore. We had heard that it was gay disco and it might be fun to go to. A friend and I were scared of it. We didn't know what to expect when we walked in the door. We had a good few pints beforehand because we didn't want anyone to see us going in there, because you could probably get queer bashed. There was a lot of bashing going on. It took a bit of courage. And then Kieran Wallace, really powerful interview with us, said, I walked by the Hirschfield trying to build up the courage, and I could hear the music coming from inside. I know this sounds made up, but they were playing Whitney Houston's I Want to Dance with Somebody. And here was me just walking by, not able to pick up the courage and go in. All I wanted to do was go inside and dance with somebody. It took me a few more months before I could walk in. I couldn't walk in on my own. And that kind of gives you a sense of what people went through. Just really briefly, the story of Bernie and Helena. Helena on the left here, and Bernie on the right. In both photos, they met in the Hirschfeld Centre, and they're still together to this day, having. So first encounters with people also meant first big loves. And these two met at a women's night disco on a Thursday evening. It was Bernie's first time in the Hirschfeld Centre after ringing up the Samaritans. They provided a number of this space, and she then quickly found out there was a women's night. She nervously went into the women's night, and her and Alina caught each other's eye. And this is then in and around that time when they met, and they are together all this time later. I would love to tell you more about their story, but time is running out, and it is in the book. But they're two fabulous, wonderful individuals whose love has transcended all of this time. And if it were not for the Hirschfeld, they may never have met, and they rightly say that in their oral history with me. So beautiful stories emerge like that. Our last theme, and then I will take some questions. Let me just check time. Yes, we have 5 minutes or so. So I'm going to do Flikkers, which was the disco at the Hirschfeld Centre, and then we'll have wrap up and questions, if that's okay. So, in recollections from everybody, there was also fragmented remembrance around the politics of dance. So, some context, Flikkers was the place to be, and not just for the gay and queer community, but more broadly. It was where even straight people wanted to go to. The Irish Times reported that it was one of the best discos in town in a report in 1984. The records that were played there often were the first play of contemporary pop music in Ireland. It had a mix of 12-inch and 7-inch albums and singles that were used by a coterie of DJs who really developed their style and talent and had different kinds of styles and created a vibrant, amazing nightclub experience. And Flikkers was one of the most prominent memories for everybody. What does Flikkers mean? Flikkers is the Dutch word for faggots, and they use this Dutch term as a way of reclamation, but also, again, to hide in plain sight. A regular person would not know the Dutch word for faggots in Ireland. So Flikkers became the means through which they were acknowledging a European trajectory, but also creating an interesting name that could operate without identifying. So dancing at the Hirschfield itself was a fractured and contested practice. And you can see the denizens of Flikkers here at a ball. This is one of the balls that the space often had. And it was often linked to emotions such as feeling exhilarated, but often some of them felt excluded. It wasn't just a utopian space when it predominantly was, but people did feel excluded. In interviews, Hirschfeld denizens not only reflect on the centrality of dance and their experiences, but also the socio-political dynamics that influenced who felt welcome and who did not. And dance itself becomes an embodied medium where people actually start to feel liberation, which we refer to as a form of disco liberation in the book. So it has a cutting-edge musical archive, and I don't have time to play the clip here, but if you Google RTE and Flikkers, you'll get a fabulous clip of a number of people dancing on the dance floor. It'll give you a vibe of things. So Flikkers didn't just play music, it invested in building one of the most sophisticated record collections in Dublin. DJs had allowances to borrow and study records, and young music lovers added prized albums. And trips to New York and London brought back music no other Irish clubs had. Tony O'Shea even, who was the centre manager, recalled playing Madonna a year before she became a star. So he got that through Sony BMG when he was in New York. So DJs were also tastemakers and trailblazers, and they nurtured DJ talent through a culture of experimentation. And then the dance floor was also a space of freedom and wonder. So dancing was a form of defiance. At Flikkers, dancing wasn't just leisure, it became a form of rebellion. As Walt Kilroy says, it goes way beyond hedonism. It's an act of liberation, of self-affirmation. It's an act of community itself. That's what Walt felt about dancing at Flikkers. They also brought queer joy and physical freedom. So Flikkers allowed people to experience unfiltered joy, uninhibited, messy, and electric. Donald Traynor recalled men dancing with poppers in their hand to Motown tracks, capturing the wild abandon and sensory pleasures. And often, many people recall poppers falling onto the wooden dance floor, seeping in. So many people's recollections were through smell, and they remember the smell of poppers and sweat because it was so jammed and hot. There was also anthems of belonging and solidarity. So some of the calls to the dance floor were songs like Tom Robinson's Glad to be Gay, and that was really, really significant. But one of the really, really significant aspects of the dance floor was a slow set. So for the DJ to essentially go to the toilet and take a toilet break, they would put on a slow set, which would be around 5 minutes long. And this was radical because you had same-sex men and women on the dance floor dancing as if they were in a ballroom of romance in rural Galway, let's just say, right? So these were all really significant radical forms. But of course, there was fractures. As Bernie Fagan says, there were men who didn't want us there and who would physically block our entrance. Then you hear a fella going on talking about the smell of fish. It was awful. Izzy Kamikaze recalls, I liked dance music and I liked clubs, and there weren't many places where you could hang out as a gay person and be comfortable. You could easily be the only woman on the premises. And then another said that, a guy felt the clones were the big muscle gays or big muscle guys with the Freddie Mercury mustache and tight vests, tight 501 jeans and builder's boots. They were quite snobbish and quite clicky. So you can see how some dynamics emerge across the dance floor. So this has been a whistle stop tour of Waking the Hirschfield and all things in terms of the oral archival history process and the oral archival history activism. But some other critical tensions emerge around the ownership of the building. Many felt because members paid dues and supported events, the centre belonged to the community, but then it had a shareholder operation because they needed to have sustainability for the building. So all of these things kind of created tensions towards the end around rebuilding the centre. You had divisions with lesbians and gay men, conflict over control, and then divisions between volunteer labour versus paid labour. But the Hirschfield is really, really crucial and central because we need to rebrick the Hirschfield. Our work shows how oral histories, such as via Waking the Hirschfield, can rebuild a lost queer space as an ephemeral archive, keeping its stories alive and resisting forgetting. It also shows that the Hirschfeld Centre held many different meanings. Remembering it means embracing this complexity. And also, as I demonstrated, collaborative memory work is really crucial. Not just doing the stale academic means of sit down, interview, record, get data, but actually working with communities in an engaged way, in letting them tell their stories on their terms and telling us, the researchers, how they want to tell their stories. Grafted memories are also a part here, though we never, I was born in 1992, so I could never experience the Hirschfield. So I'm kind of grafting memories, my own, onto it and carrying that forward into queer history. So it's kind of a strange kind of intergenerational thing that's happening there. But also, this reflects a political commitment as well to keeping the Hirschfield awake, hence the name Waking the Hirschfield. And I suppose I'll end on this. It's a call to action. Remembering queer spaces like the Hirschfield is collective work, intergenerational, transnational, and ongoing. And we are two among many, and many more are needed. And when we are rebricking the Hirschfield, we're rebricking a Hirschfeld Centre, not the Hirschfeld Centre, because we can never recreate that building. I'll end on this note. This plaque right here is on the building currently. Have a read of that there. Hirschfeld Centre, Ireland's first gay social and community space established here. That is incorrect. That was a sign put there by Dublin City Council that is boldly correct. And Dublin City Council were completely aware of this and completely did not acknowledge the Phoenix Club that came before this. Caused quite a lot of consternation at the time. Why I'm ending on that point? It demonstrates the fragility of memory, the fragility of the archive, and how particular narratives or how particular agendas can emerge to put particular forms of actual history out of the picture. And that's why we need to be really careful in our collaboration and in our historical work. So that has been quite a whistle stop tour of all things Hirschfield. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I am more than happy to take any questions from you all. So thank you very much for indulging me for the last number of minutes. And I hope that was helpful and interesting at the very least. So thank you, folks.
Thank you so much, Páraic. That was amazing. Yeah, it's just so interesting to hear about the history of these places that no longer exist and how we can rebrick them, as you say, through oral histories and other means, especially when there's so little in the, archives of the state or kind of institutional archives, as you say. Katie, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, great.